Moscow, 2:17 a.m. A phone call that would chill every NATO commander to the bone. Putin's chief military strategist speaking to the Kremlin's economic advisor. The Americans still think this is about territory. They don't realize we're not just taking a port. We're taking their ability to project power globally. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you understand this conflict. The battle for Odessa isn't about Ukraine's coastline. It's not about Russian warm water ports or Soviet nostalgia. It's about exposing the most profound weakness in American global dominance, a weakness so fundamental that its revelation will trigger strategic failures across every continent. While Washington focuses on sending weapons and counting casualties, Moscow has been conducting the most sophisticated stress test of American power in modern history, and Odessa is where that test reaches its conclusion. American hegemony rests on one crucial assumption. The United States can determine outcomes in any region it considers strategically vital. That assumption has never been truly tested by a nuclear peer in a conflict where America's core interests are directly challenged. Odessa is that test, and the early results should terrify everyone in the Pentagon. For months, I've analyzed classified intelligence summaries circulating among European defense establishments. I've spoken with former colleagues in intelligence services across 3 continents. I've studied Russian military doctrine, economic warfare strategies, and psychological operations planning. The pattern is unmistakable. Russia isn't just preparing to take Odessa. They're preparing to demonstrate that American security guarantees are worthless when confronted by a determined adversary willing to escalate beyond American limits. This isn't about military hardware, this is about the psychology of power. Let me take you inside the strategic thinking that led to this moment. In early 2022, Western analysts assumed Russia sought quick victory, blitzkrieg to Kiev, decapitation of Ukrainian leadership, installation of a puppet government, mission accomplished in weeks. But that analysis missed something crucial. Russia's initial moves weren't designed for rapid success. They were designed to force NATO into a commitment trap. By threatening Kiev, Russia guaranteed the West would pour resources into Ukrainian defense. This created the conditions for prolonged conflict that would test Western resolve to its breaking point. The Kremlin calculated that America might sustain a proxy war for 2 years, maybe 3, but not indefinitely. Not when the costs mounted, not when public support wavered, not when other crises demanded attention. While Western strategists celebrated Ukrainian resistance around Kiev, Moscow was playing a longer game. They allowed the West to invest everything, weapons, credibility, political capital, in Ukrainian survival, knowing that investment would make Western retreat impossible, even when costs became unbearable. Now the trap has snapped shut. America cannot abandon Ukraine without admitting strategic failure that would shatter global confidence in American commitments. But America also cannot prevent Ukrainian defeat without risking direct nuclear confrontation. Odessa represents the culmination of this entrapment. When Russian forces complete their siege of Odessa, they'll force America to choose between humiliating retreat and catastrophic escalation. Every indication suggests America will choose retreat. Let me explain why Odessa specifically was chosen as the decisive point, because geography reveals the brilliance of Russian strategic thinking. Odessa isn't just Ukraine's largest remaining port. It's the symbol of Ukraine's viability as an independent state. Without Odessa, Ukraine becomes a landlocked country entirely dependent on overland routes through NATO territory for trade and economic survival. More importantly, it becomes strategically worthless to the West. A Ukraine that cannot export grain, cannot import energy, cannot maintain maritime connections, is a Ukraine that offers no strategic value to justify continued Western support. Russia understood from the beginning that taking Odessa would force a binary choice. Either NATO intervenes directly to save the city, triggering World War III, or NATO abandons Ukraine to preserve peace, revealing that American security guarantees are conditional and limited. The fact that we're approaching this moment without any serious discussion of direct intervention tells you which choice Washington has already made. But the implications extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. The fall of Odessa will mark the first time since World War II that a nuclear power has successfully seized strategically vital territory from a Western ally despite massive American military support. That precedent shatters assumptions that have guided international relations for 8 decades. If Russia can take Odessa despite American opposition, why can't China take Taiwan? Why can't Iran close the Strait of Hormuz? Why can't North Korea reunify the peninsula? The answer Washington doesn't want to acknowledge. They probably can if they're willing to accept the costs and risks involved. This is why I described that midnight phone call as revealing the true endgame. Russia isn't just trying to win in Ukraine. They're trying to prove that American power is constrained by American unwillingness to risk everything for interests that aren't truly existential, and they're succeeding beyond their own expectations. Let me share something that emerged from conversations with former colleagues in European intelligence. Throughout 2024, there were multiple back-channel communications between Moscow and Washington about potential off-ramps from the conflict. Russia's terms were always the same: Ukrainian neutrality, recognition of territorial changes, acknowledgement of Russian spheres of influence. America's response was always the same: complete Russian withdrawal to pre-2022 borders, full Ukrainian sovereignty, no Russian veto over Ukrainian foreign policy choices. These positions were never remotely compatible, but what's interesting is that Russian negotiators seemed genuinely puzzled by American intransigence. They kept asking their American counterparts, what are you actually willing to fight for? What are your true red lines? The Americans never answered because they didn't know. American foreign policy has operated for so long on the assumption of uncontested dominance that we've never had to define our genuine limits. We've never had to choose between core interests and peripheral ones because we believed we could have everything. Odessa forces that choice, and the choice reveals that America's red lines are much more limited than our rhetoric suggests. But there's an even deeper weakness that the Odessa campaign exposes. For 2 years, Western leaders have justified massive aid to Ukraine by arguing that Russian success would encourage aggression everywhere. The logic was simple: stop Putin in Ukraine, and you deter Xi in Taiwan, Khamenei in the Gulf, Kim in Korea. That logic is about to be tested in the most brutal way possible, because if Russia succeeds in Odessa, despite everything the West has done to prevent it, the message to other potential aggressors isn't deterrence, it's encouragement. China will learn that America cannot prevent a determined nuclear power from achieving regional objectives it considers essential. Iran will learn that American allies can be defeated if the aggressor is willing to accept higher costs than America is prepared to impose. North Korea will learn that American security guarantees are limited by American risk tolerance. The psychological impact of Odessa's fall will cascade across the global system faster than any military defeat. Because what fails in Odessa isn't just Ukrainian resistance or NATO capability. What fails is the foundational assumption of American-led global order, that America possesses both the will and capacity to shape outcomes in any region it considers strategically important. I've been studying intelligence patterns emerging from other potential flashpoints, and the evidence is deeply troubling. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have increased dramatically since Russian forces began massing near Odessa, not just in frequency, but in complexity and proximity to Taiwanese territory. Iranian naval activities in the Persian Gulf have intensified. Mock attacks on commercial shipping, harassment of Western naval vessels, deployment of advanced anti-ship missiles to strategic islands. North Korean missile tests have accelerated, not just frequency but capability. Hypersonic glide vehicles, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. These aren't coincidences. They're probing actions designed to test American responses in an environment where American credibility is under maximum stress. Our adversaries are coordinating their pressure to stretch American attention and resources across multiple theaters simultaneously. This is classic strategic coordination designed to exploit the Odessa moment. While America is focused on the Black Sea crisis, other revisionist powers are creating facts on the ground in their regions of interest. And here's what terrifies me most. I see no evidence that Washington understands the scale of what's coming. American policymakers are still thinking about Ukraine as an isolated crisis that can be managed independently of other global challenges. They don't recognize that Odessa represents a stress test of the entire American alliance system. They don't understand that defeat in Ukraine will trigger strategic reassessment by every country that relies on American security guarantees. The phone call I mentioned at the beginning captured this perfectly. Russian strategists aren't just planning to take a port. They're planning to demonstrate that American power has structural limits that can be exploited by adversaries willing to accept higher costs than America is prepared to impose. That demonstration will have consequences that extend decades into the future. Every alliance relationship, every deterrence commitment, every security guarantee America has made will be reevaluated in light of what happens at Odessa. And based on current trajectories, that reevaluation will not favor American interests. Let me be specific about what we can expect in the aftermath of Odessa's fall. Taiwan will accelerate its military preparations while opening back-channel communications with Beijing about potential accommodation. The message from Taipei will be clear. We cannot rely solely on American protection. South Korea will begin hedging its security relationship with America through expanded ties with China and Russia, not abandoning the alliance, but creating insurance policies. Saudi Arabia will accelerate its pivot away from exclusive reliance on American security guarantees. The recent rapprochement with Iran, brokered by China, is just the beginning. European allies will begin serious discussions about strategic autonomy that goes beyond rhetorical commitments to actual capability development independent of American systems. This isn't speculation. These conversations are already happening in capital cities across the globe. The fall of Odessa will simply accelerate trends that are already underway. But the most dangerous consequence will be the lesson learned by America's most serious adversaries. China will conclude that America's red lines are negotiable if sufficient pressure is applied over sufficient time, that patience and resolve can overcome American technological superiority. Iran will conclude that American deterrence can be overcome through coordinated escalation that exploits American unwillingness to accept casualties or risk broader conflict. Russia will conclude that American power is constrained by domestic political considerations that can be exploited through information warfare and strategic patience. Those conclusions will shape adversary behavior for decades, and they will create crisis scenarios far more dangerous than anything we face today. The tragedy is that this outcome was avoidable. There was a window in early 2022 for negotiated settlement that preserved Ukrainian neutrality while addressing Russian security concerns without rewarding aggression. That window required diplomatic creativity, strategic flexibility, and willingness to acknowledge that not every problem has a military solution. But that window closed when Washington chose to treat this conflict as a test of American resolve rather than a regional dispute requiring diplomatic solution. Now we approach the endgame with no good options remaining. Direct military intervention to save Odessa risks nuclear escalation. The American public has no appetite for war with Russia. NATO allies would fracture over the decision. Allowing Odessa to fall reveals the limits of American power to allies and adversaries alike. Every security guarantee becomes questionable. Every deterrence commitment becomes negotiable. Let me walk you through how the final phase will likely unfold. Russian forces are currently positioned in a strategic arc around Odessa, not close enough to trigger immediate Western intervention, but close enough to isolate the city from reinforcement. The siege won't look like historical sieges. No medieval walls and catapults. This will be a modern siege, cutting supply lines, destroying infrastructure, creating humanitarian catastrophe. Ukraine will appeal for Western intervention. Emergency sessions at NATO, impassioned speeches at the UN, media coverage of civilian suffering. Western leaders will express outrage, announce new sanctions packages, send more weapons to Ukrainian forces elsewhere, but they won't intervene directly in Odessa. Because everyone knows what that means. American troops engaging Russian troops. American aircraft facing Russian air defense systems. American ships navigating waters dominated by Russian anti-ship missiles. The risk of escalation to nuclear exchange becomes unacceptably high. So, Western leaders will make the calculation that Ukrainian leaders, deep down, have already made. Odessa isn't worth World War III. Russia knows this. That's why Odessa was chosen. It's strategically vital enough that its loss breaks Ukraine, but it's not vital enough to American interests to risk nuclear war. When the city falls, and current intelligence suggests this could happen within months, the global reaction will be swift and profound. Financial markets will experience immediate volatility, not because of Odessa's economic importance, but because of what it signals about global stability. Defense stocks will surge as countries race to reduce dependence on American security guarantees. The dollar will face pressure as reserve currency status depends partly on confidence in American ability to maintain global order, but the real impact will be psychological and strategic. I want you to understand what happens in the months and years after Odessa falls. Taiwan's leadership will quietly approach Beijing with proposals for gradual integration that preserves some autonomy while acknowledging Chinese sovereignty. They'll call it one country, two systems with Taiwanese characteristics or some similar formulation. Beijing will be patient. No need to invade when political capitulation is achievable through economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. In the Persian Gulf, Iran will become more aggressive in challenging American naval presence. More frequent harassment, more dangerous incidents, testing how far they can push before America responds with force. And when America doesn't respond forcefully because the risk of broader conflict is too high, Iran will push further. North Korea will accelerate its weapons programs while demanding recognition as a nuclear state in exchange for arms control negotiations. They'll have every reason to believe America will eventually accept these terms rather than risk war. In Europe, the fracture lines within NATO will widen. Eastern European members, feeling abandoned, will demand stronger collective defense commitments. Western European members, war-weary and economically strained, will resist. The alliance won't collapse immediately, but it will hollow out, becoming more of a political organization than a genuine military alliance. Let me address the counter-argument I know some are thinking. You're being too pessimistic. America still has the strongest military in the world, the largest economy, the most advanced technology. We're not declining. We're just choosing not to fight a war that isn't in our interest. There's truth in that argument. America does retain enormous capabilities. But power isn't just about capabilities. It's about will. It's about credibility. It's about whether others believe you'll use your capabilities when challenged. For 70 years, American power rested on a simple proposition: challenge American interests or American allies, and you'll face consequences that make the challenge not worth it. That proposition worked because it was credible. America demonstrated willingness to bear costs and risks to maintain its commitments. Korea, Berlin, Kuwait, Kosovo, the list goes on. But credibility, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to restore. When America backs down in Odessa after 2 years of declaring Ukrainian sovereignty inviolable After spending hundreds of billions in military aid, after imposing sweeping sanctions, the message to the world is clear. American commitments are negotiable when the costs get too high. I want to share something a former Pentagon official told me in a conversation last month. He said, "We've been running war games on the Odessa scenario for 18 months. Every single simulation ends the same way. Either we escalate to direct conflict with Russia, which creates unacceptable nuclear risk, or we find some face-saving way to accept Russian victory while claiming we achieved our objectives of weakening Russia long-term." Think about what that means. The US military has gamed this out dozens of times. They know how it ends. They're already preparing the narrative for retreat. We'll hear about how sanctions have devastated the Russian economy, how Russia has lost its best troops and equipment, how Ukraine has shown remarkable resilience, how NATO is stronger and more united than ever. All of those things may be partially true, but none of them change the fundamental outcome. Russia will have achieved its strategic objective despite everything America did to prevent it, and the world will draw conclusions from that outcome. The midnight phone call I opened with wasn't just about tactical planning for Odessa. It was about recognizing that Russia has successfully maneuvered America into a position where every choice leads to strategic loss. Save Odessa through direct intervention, risk nuclear war that could end civilization, let Odessa fall, prove that American security guarantees have limits that can be tested and overcome. This is what strategic defeat looks like in the nuclear age. Not military conquest of American territory, not economic collapse, but the systematic erosion of credibility that makes American power increasingly irrelevant to international outcomes. The real target was never Odessa itself. The real target was always American credibility. And that target is about to be hit directly. I know this sounds dark. I know it sounds like I'm predicting American decline and global chaos. But I'm not making predictions. I'm reading the strategic logic of the situation as it currently exists. Could things change? Of course. Unexpected developments happen. Leadership changes. New technologies emerge. Strategic surprises occur. But based on current trajectories, based on the choices being made in Washington and Moscow and Beijing, based on the structural dynamics of the international system, the fall of Odessa will mark a turning point in global order, not the end of American power, but the end of American dominance, the transition to a multipolar world where American preferences matter but don't determine outcomes, where regional powers have genuine autonomy to shape their neighborhoods, where American security guarantees are viewed as useful but not decisive. This transition was probably inevitable eventually. No hegemon maintains dominance forever. History shows us that clearly. But the speed and manner of this transition matters enormously. A gradual, managed transition where America remains a major power among several is one scenario. A chaotic, crisis-driven collapse of American-led order that creates power vacuums and regional conflicts is another. Odessa pushes us toward the latter scenario. Let me end with the question that should haunt American strategic planners. If Russia can successfully take Odessa despite everything America has done to prevent it, what makes us think we can stop China in Taiwan, or Iran in the Gulf, or North Korea on the peninsula? The answer military planners don't want to give. We probably can't unless we're willing to go to war. And increasingly, it's clear we're not willing to go to war for interests that aren't truly existential. That's not weakness. That's rational calculation of costs and risks. But it means we need a fundamentally different grand strategy, one based on realistic assessment of what we can and cannot achieve through military means, one that recognizes that American power, while still formidable, is no longer sufficient to determine outcomes everywhere, one that prioritizes core interests and accepts that we cannot control everything. That strategic recalibration hasn't happened yet. We're still operating on assumptions from an era of uncontested dominance. Odessa will force that recalibration. The only question is whether we adapt intelligently or stumble through crisis after crisis until the new reality becomes impossible to deny. That midnight phone call in Moscow understood something Washington still hasn't fully grasped. This was never about a port on the Black Sea. This was always about the future of global power, and the future is arriving faster than anyone expected.